So now that we know how to get MIDI into our DAW, we're going to look at how to edit it once it's there. We're going to look at how to do editing operations that are comparable to the ones that we did with audio, editing MIDI as data items that we can kind of move around the DAW. But we're also going to look at how to edit MIDI messages in much more fine-grained ways than we were able to with audio, because MIDI is symbolic and we're able to delve down to the level of individual messages. And then we'll also talk about quantization and humanization and their role in editing MIDI. So let's go ahead and start with the MIDI data items, the editing operations that are comparable to what we were doing with audio. We can do all the exact same things and they work pretty much as you would expect. We can move things around, copy paste them, change the duration, and split and glue items. So I want to just briefly show you how that works. So I'm over here in Reaper now, and I have this file that we imported in the last video here. That one. And so I can move it, I can drag around, just like we did with audio. I can copy and paste it, like that, if I wanted to repeat a bunch of times. I'll go ahead and undo that for now. I can also change the duration by moving my cursor to the end, and then dragging it to extend to be whatever length I want. And again, it will loop that as much as we want to fill out that space. It's not actually stretching this in time at all. So it just repeats. I can also split and glue items. So if I, for instance, wanted to take beat 4 here and move it to the beginning so that it starts with beat 4 and then plays beats 1 through 3, I could go to my item menu here. You see I put my cursor at beat 3. And I can go to the item menu and say split items at cursor. And I end up with 2 items that I can drag separately. So I can move this back, move that to the front. And then if I want to be able to edit that as one chunk again, I can go to item and I can glue that back together. Glue items, because I've shift-clicked it to select both of them. And then we have this in another order. And then I could extend that as well if I wanted to, like so. So again, all of these things are very comparable to what we did in Module 2 when we were working with digital audio and with waveforms. What I want to talk about now is what we can do if we go down one level of the hierarchy. And we're talking about editing the MIDI messages themselves rather than just editing these kind of groupings of MIDI messages like we just were. And if you remember, this Reaper project file actually contains the MIDI messages inside of them. And they're just encoded as these strings of binary numbers here represented in hexadecimal form. And so I suppose if you were really kind of crazy, you could just open this file up and you could start editing these numbers manually if you want to change values of these different MIDI messages. But that would be extremely painful, and I do not advocate that. Instead, there are much better ways to do this within the DAW. And so we're going to look at 2 editing views that are available to us, a piano roll view and an event list view. And we'll look at how to edit pitch and duration and other data like velocity or MIDI control change messages. And then we'll look at some broader operations that we might do, quantization and humanization in particular, and why we might want to do them. So let's go right back to Reaper here. And we still have this item here. And if this had been an audio item and I had double-clicked on it, I would have just gotten a properties dialog box where it had the name of the item and its location on disk and some other basic properties of it. But if I double-click on this, it actually opens a whole editing pane where I can edit the individual MIDI data within here. And so this is called the piano roll view. But first I want to look at a different view called the event list view. So I go here in the view menu that's shown up. This is a menu that only shows up when I'm in this editing mode. And I go mode event list. And here I just see all the MIDI messages that are part of this. So actually for some reason when I recorded this, I'm not sure why, there's all these program change messages in there. They don't really need to be there, especially not so many of the same ones. So I'm just going to go ahead and shift click to select them all and delete them. Now I can really see what's in here. I've got all these different note messages. And each one, it has a position, so it tells me where it starts, it tells me how long it is. Now it's not showing me note on and note off messages separately. It's collapsing them to one thing. So that's why it's showing me the length. It's just showing me where it starts and how long it goes on for. I see the channel. I see the MIDI note. And I see the velocity value. These are all 64 as it happens to be. If I want to edit any of these, I can just double click on them. And I can control where does it start, how long is it, what channel is it on, what is the note, what is the velocity, and so on and so forth. If I want to add a new message, then all I have to do is hit this little add button there, and then I can add a new message. And again, I can pick all those parameters and what I want them to be. I can put in different types of messages too. So if I wanted to put in a control change message, I could pick the channel, I could pick the controller number, and I could pick the value. So if I wanted to add some modulation, I could pick my mod wheel there and pick a value for it and so on and so forth. I'm not going to add that right now, but that's how you would do it. So I get very fine-grained detail over every single MIDI message and all of its values, corresponding exactly to what we looked at when we were looking a couple of videos ago at the MIDI specification. If I switch back to the piano roll view, I get a much more visual representation of my data that I can also edit. So I can, of course, play this in here. Let me go ahead and stop that. But I can also edit any of these things individually. So I can take this note and I can drag it. That's actually changing the velocity when I drag it like that. But I can also drag it up or down. So I can change it to a different MIDI note number. I can change its velocity. So if I wanted, say, if I wanted my first note to be really loud and then for them to be a little softer and then start getting louder again, I can edit all these velocity values individually. And maybe the last one is soft again. And I'll try changing that pitch again. And so on and so forth. I can also change my view just like I do in the main DAW window. I can change my zoom horizontally and also vertically if I need to zoom out to view more notes at the same time. So obviously, if this isn't clear already, we have time on our x-axis just like in the DAW. And on the y-axis here, we have a picture of a keyboard. That's why this is called a piano roll view. And there's another reason I'll show you in a second. Which is showing pitches. So pitches are y-axis and times are x-axis. So we've seen how we can move notes around, change their velocity. I can also change their duration by going to the end here and dragging them to be shorter or longer, like that. So that note is sustaining a lot longer now. And I can draw my own notes. If I go someplace where there is no note, I can just draw something in, like so. Those are some of the main things that I can do here. I can also work with different controllers if I want. So right now we see down here we're editing velocity. If I wanted to edit, say, pitch bend messages, I could go to pitch bend there. There's nothing in there right now, but if I double click anywhere, I'll create a new pitch bend value. So I can start changing the pitch up and down over the course of this passage. And so on and so forth. I don't actually think that improves it at all, so I'm going to go ahead and delete those right now. But you can do any control change message this way, or pitch bend, or program change, or some other things like that. I'll switch back to the view of velocity for right now. So those are the basic ways to get around here. There's a few other global operations that you might want to do on a bunch of notes. And so I'll just go to Edit and I'll select all here. Select all events. Selected everything. One thing I might want to do is just transpose all of them, to change everything up and down by a certain amount. So I go, I don't know why they put this in the View menu, but it's in the View menu. So I go View Transpose here, and I can change everything by a certain number of semitones, chromatic steps on a keyboard. So I could change it by I could change it by 12 here, put everything up an octave, and then I could listen to that. The other thing that I can do is I can quantize or humanize notes, and that's going to change basically how they snap to this timing grid. And to show you, because these notes are already kind of perfectly aligned with this timing grid, so to show you what I really mean, I want to go to a different file here, and this is a file I recorded where I deliberately made the note values not quite line up with my metronome. So I'll go ahead and play this with the click track playing back so you can hear a comparison of the two. So if I double click on this again to get back into my editing view, and I'll zoom this out a little bit, zoom this in a little bit so we can see these note values. You can see they're not aligned with the grid perfectly. Nothing's quite right there. So if I select all on this, and I go to view and quantize, you can see immediately it's gotten everything to be aligned to this grid here, so that all my attacks and all my releases are aligned with this grid, which in this case I think is at every 16th note. If I wanted to align this to every 8th note, I could zoom out like that, and then everything would be rounding off to the nearest 8th note for its attack and its release. That made some of these notes have no duration at all when I did that, so I'm going to go ahead and switch that back to 16th note, and we can play this and hear what it sounds like. So now everything is lining up perfectly. And I have different options about how I can do this. I can only do the start times. So now you can see all my start times are lining up perfectly, but my releases are all still a little bit off. Or I could, even if I do both, I can also have a strength, which is how much is it going to snap it towards the grid. Right now it's at 100%, it's going to go all the way, but what if I put that down to about 50%? It's going partway towards making it more precise, but it's not taking them exactly to those grid lines. And then once I arrive at something I like, in this case maybe it might be total precision, I can hit OK and it will save those changes. But this raises an interesting question because there's all these options here about having it quantized less than perfect. Why would you want it to be quantized less than perfect? Well, when I play this back and it is perfectly quantized, it doesn't really sound like a human being played it anymore. It sounds too perfect. No human would be able to play with that level of exact precision. It's just not possible to get all those attacks and releases down to this extremely precise level of accuracy in terms of timing. And that may be a sound that you're looking for, or it might make your track sound a little bit too robotic, a little bit too stiff. And so if you do end up with audio, I'm sorry, not with audio, if you do end up with MIDI data that looks like this, where it's totally perfect when you get it in, maybe because you put it in by hand or it was created by some other way, or it got quantized in the past and you lost the original, you might want to actually add some randomization to the timings on it. And that's what humanization is about. It's the opposite of quantization. It's making the data less precise. So you can see as soon as I open this humanized dialog box, everything started moving around because I can introduce a kind of random element with my timing. I can also do it with my velocities. Originally, all the velocities here were at 127, which also isn't very human sounding. So you can introduce some humanization there as well, and you can hear the difference. Now maybe that's too much. Maybe I don't want that much variation, so I can turn this down, make it a little bit subtler. But again, I can arrive at what I want, and then hit OK to commit it. So those are some basic editing operations, both on the local level of individual notes, but also on a more global level of working with our MIDI data in aggregate that we might want to do. And all of these things are obviously very difficult, in some cases impossible to do with audio data, because we don't have that ability to separate out a waveform into all these individual events that we can edit individually. So this is one of the ways that MIDI is really powerful. I want to talk for a second before we close this video here about some of the historical context of this piano roll editing view and this idea of editing like this that we saw. It goes straight back to player pianos, where you would have these player player piano rolls, that's this thing right here, that has a bunch of holes punched into it, and those would then trigger different keys on the piano to play back. And so this is where this notion of a piano roll representation of MIDI data comes from, and that's why it's called that. But I also wanted to talk about some of the artistic implications of this, that we have this ability to edit things on this piano roll to basically turn this MIDI data into anything that we want. And so back in the realm of the player piano, there was a composer that explored this idea with piano rolls and analog player pianos to an extreme. His name was Konlon Nankuro, and over the course of his career, he composed a number of studies for player piano. He would do this not by playing something on a piano that would then punch these holes on the roll, but by hand punching all these holes. It would take him months to get everything just the way he wanted. And he did this because he wanted to create music that wasn't possible for a human being to play on a piano. There were two things that were kind of impossible about the music that he was making. One was that there would just be far too many notes coming too fast for a human being to play. But the other thing was he liked to explore things with tempo and timing. They're really impossible for a human player to negotiate. So in this particular piece I want you to check out, it's a canon. So there's two different voices. We can think of it as being two different tracks in DAW language. And they're playing the same music. They're transposed an octave or two apart. But they're playing the same music. But one of them is starting off at an extremely fast tempo, a crazy, superhuman tempo, and slowing down little by little over the course of the piece. The other one is starting off at an extremely slow tempo and speeding up and speeding up and speeding up over the course of the piece. So essentially you have, if this is our time axis here on the x-axis, and our tempo axis is on the y-axis, you can imagine one of the voices is starting off at a very slow tempo and getting faster and faster, and one of them is starting off at a very fast tempo and getting slower and slower. And that's essentially what the structural idea that he's trying to explore in this piece. In this case, the piano roll and punching these things out, this piano roll representation of music, was really mission critical in enabling him to realize this idea. We can think of MIDI sequencing as, yes, sometimes we just want it to represent music, and it's a good way to represent and edit and work with music. But it can also give us an opportunity to create things and transform things in ways that we could never do if we were just playing it live on a keyboard. So to review quickly, because we've covered a lot of ground in this video, and we've looked at editing MIDI items using the same techniques we use for editing audio items. We've looked at also delving down to this deeper level of individual MIDI messages and editing them using an event list view and also a piano roll view. And then we've looked at editing MIDI messages in aggregate with techniques like transposition, quantization, and humanization. And then we've also talked a little bit about the historical context of this notion of a piano roll and the music of Konlon Nankuro. What we're going to come to next are looking at effects on MIDI tracks, how to add them, and different options, again, that are available to us that did not exist with audio tracks.